Just so we're all on the same page, I know a lot of you are very knowledgeable about near-death experience, but just so that we're all on the same page, a near-death experience is, as the name implies, you're near death. In other words, you're so physically compromised, you're generally unconscious and may be clinically dead with absent heartbeat, absent respiration. Now, at that time that you're unconscious, and it should be impossible to have a lucid, organized remembrance, you do have the experience part of a near-death experience. We'll get into that briefly. Now, I want to emphasize no two near-death experiences are the same, but all of us researchers that have studied them see that there are a very consistent pattern of elements or what occurs during the near-death experience typically occurring in the same consistent pattern of occurrence. So these are the near-death experience elements, and I don't want to go through all of them, but very often you see what's called an out-of-body experience that occurs initially. Consciousness rises above the body. There's heightened senses, typically very positive emotions, the classic passing into or through a tunnel, encountering that mystical light in the end of the tunnel. Deceased relatives are often there, life reviews, often encountering unearthly, or if you will, heavenly realms are commonly reported. And then ultimately at the end, they have to return to their earthly life. So that's very briefly a typical detailed near-death experience right there. Well, I got interested in this over 20 years ago, and because I had a burning question about the reality of near-death experiences, I set up a website. NDERF is the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. From its inception, it has been a public service. We haven't had anything for sale, and up until very recently, we didn't even have a 501c3 branch. We really wanted to share with the public what had been shared with us freely from people all around the world. And when I say all around the world, I really mean that. We've got portions of that website, the NDE research website, in over 30 different languages. And remarkably, we have accumulated over 4,000 near-death experiences from people sharing with us. I want you to keep in mind as I go through this, as remarkable as this is going to sound, it's a basic scientific principle that what is real is consistently observed. And you're going to see remarkable consistency in what we've observed in NDEs as we go through this. I really want to give a special thanks to my wife, Jody. She's a licensed attorney, and yet she has devoted her full-time job to the website. She's now the webmaster. That's literally what she does all day long because it's such a huge project, and it's due to her efforts, our labor of love, that we're able to talk about our research from the website today. Well, who has a near-death experience anyway? A Gallup survey published in 1981 found that about 5% of adults in America had a prior history of a near-death experience. After extensive research spanning all the way back to 1975, we absolutely cannot predict who will have a near-death experience or what the content will be. Near-death experiences can happen to anyone, children and adults, physicians and scientists, clergy, religious, even atheists have typical near-death experience, and those who never heard of near-death experience, all of us can have it. Around 10 to 20% of those who nearly die can have a near-death experience. So the bottom line is anyone can have an NDE. And just to emphasize, I'll be using the term over and over, NDE, as an abbreviation for near-death experience. We published back some years ago, my first book, Evidence of the Afterlife, became a New York Times bestseller within 8 days. It's had a huge public interest on the NBC Today show, the O'Reilly Factor that was more impressive until he got in trouble, Dr. Oz show, National Geographic Channel, and even was asked to present at the New York Academy of Sciences. And down here where I live in a small town, southern Louisiana, Houma, Louisiana, extensive local interest. So it's been a lot of fun to do this, as well as very informative and inspirational, literally to tens of millions of people that have heard these shows, presentations throughout the world. What I'm going to talk about are the survey results. The most recent full survey is we have different versions of a survey on our NDERF website. The most recent, the second, I guess, to last survey we had before we closed accrual had 1,122 near-death experiences sequentially shared. In analysis of that data, we found 9 lines of evidence that all converged on the reality that near-death experiences are, in the word, real, and we're going to get into that very briefly. So what are those 9 lines of evidence that we had from my initial study? Well, the first line of evidence is during that period of unconsciousness or clinical death, people have crystal clear consciousness. To understand how amazing that is, consider after a cardiac arrest, well, of course, immediately when your heart stops pumping, blood immediately stops growing to the brain. A measure of brain electrical activity called EEG or electroencephalogram is absolutely flat 10 to 20 seconds after a cardiac arrest. And yet, in my study, I found that nearly 75%, 3 out of 4, during that time of unconsciousness or clinical death, they actually were having more consciousness and alertness at that time than during their earthly everyday life, which is absolutely medically inexplicable. The remaining 20% said that their consciousness was normal compared to their earthly everyday consciousness. And only 5%, even though they were physically unconsciousness, described less consciousness and alertness than their earthly everyday life. Now, it's important to remember near-death experiences are remembered verbatim, literally word for word, decades after their occurrence. All of this is pointing to it being a very special type of consciousness. Well, the second line of evidence, and very important, are these so-called out-of-body observations. A fairly common initial event in near-death experiences is that out-of-body experience. Consciousness separates from that unconscious or clinically dead body. And to me, as a researcher, I ask the question, is what they're seeing with their consciousness above their physical body real? Well, about 45% of the time in near-death experiences, they describe ongoing earthly events, often frantic efforts at resuscitating them from their life-threatening event. So my question, are their observations, are what they're seeing real? Well, we've had a prospective study, 2 of them actually, Sabom and Sartori, both found that they appeared to be real. Dr. Jan Holden did an entire literature review of published out-of-body observations and found 92% of the time they were without any apparent inaccuracy. And in my study, the largest of this phenomena, 287 people that had that out-of-body observations, to my astonishment, I found 98% of the time what they described were without any apparent inaccuracy, both in my review and the person who had the near-death experience sharing it. Again, just to understand how remarkable this is, many of these out-of-body experiences involve consciousness far from the physical body and geographically far from any possible sensory awareness. We've had people code in the operating room, consciousness drifts to other parts of the hospital, and almost invariably, what they see and hear, even far from their physical body, is absolutely correct, even if they go back and verify it. So we do research and find to be evidential. How about visual near-death experiences in the blind? Okay, the blind can vary. You can have those that have been totally blind from birth or develop blindness in life. It can be complete or partial blindness. The toughest test would be those born totally blind and remained blind throughout birth. I've interviewed a lady who had this, Vicky, born totally blind and stayed totally blind. These have been reported in case reports, and remarkably, when people that are born totally blind have a near-death experience, a life-threatening event, they can have vision and have very typical near-death experiences, but with classic content and with classic vision. The one person I interviewed, Vicky, described what's called 360-degree vision. She could see front, back, right, left, and up, down, all simultaneously. It was tough for Vicky, born blind from birth, to understand the rest of us have these sort of pie-shaped visual fields, because don't forget, in her entire life, she only knew spherical, if you will, vision. So absolutely medically inexplicable for people to have that kind of picture-perfect vision. And just to illustrate this, Marta G was a 5-year-old girl who was blind and unfortunately went into a lake, and here's what happened. After Marta went into the lake and she was again blind, I slowly breathed in the water and immediately lost consciousness. A beautiful woman dressed in bright white light pulled me out and this is a spiritual figure, looking into my eyes, asked me what I wanted. I was completely satisfied and could think of nothing until it occurred to me to take a trip around the lake. I did and saw detail I would have never seen in real life. I could go anywhere, even to the tops of trees, by simply intending to do so. I was legally blind and for the first time saw leaves on trees, birds' feathers, bird's eyes, details on telephone poles and in people's backyards that were far more acute than 20/20 vision. Mundane details to us, birds' feathers, telephone poles, but if you've never seen it before in your life, it's absolutely amazing. Okay, here's a fourth line of evidence. Under general anesthesia, under adequate general anesthesia, you should have no conscious remembrance at all. If you code, if your heart stops while you're under general anesthesia, which is very well monitored, it should be, if you will, doubly impossible to have a lucid organized experience. However, I studied 23 near-death experiences that were very clearly documented as having occurred during general anesthesia. They absolutely occur. They're typical near-death experiences. In my questionnaire, there were 33 questions pertaining to the elements of the near-death experience, or what actually happens. 32 of the 33 elements occurred equally often in the near-death experience group associated with anesthesia, as compared to near-death experiences occurring under all other types of circumstances. The only difference is the people under general anesthesia that had their near-death experience statistically were more likely to have a tunnel experience. I don't know why. But importantly, my key question about what was your level of consciousness and alertness during this experience, absolutely the same, whether they were under general anesthesia or had their near-death experience under any other circumstance. Powerful evidence right there that near-death experiences are absolutely occurring separate from physical brain function the way that we understand it. Go on quickly. Oh, probably already you're seeing some pretty powerful evidence for the reality of near-death experiences and its consistent message that our consciousness survives bodily death. Well, what do the skeptics say? And that's important to note that over 20 different explanations, so-called explanations, have been proposed by skeptics over the years. You name it, I've heard just about every physiological, psychological, and cultural explanation possible. The reason there's over 20 different explanations is very simple. The skeptics themselves can't agree on any one or several explanations of near-death experience that they accept as adequately explaining NDE. I mean, think about that. If there was really a decent explanation of NDE, you wouldn't have over 20 different explanations competing with each other. But moving on quickly, we'll go through lines 5 of 7 lines of evidence for the reality of NDE. There's a life review. During the life review, which is observed about 17% of the time in near-death experiences, you may see all or a part of your prior life reviewed. Long forgotten memories may be recalled, and when I researched this, I found that when people had a life review, even if they'd forgotten the memories, often in early childhood, if they later checked it out after they recovered from what nearly killed them, they find that even if they forgot it, what they saw in the life review really did happen, even if they'd forgotten it. I always put fear not the life review because some people fear the life review. I can assure you during the life review and near-death experiences, essentially never is there external judgment. You're being shown your prior life. You have to decide and make a judgment, if any, about what you have to think about your own prior life. Certainly in near-death experiences, that's not at all unusual to encounter deceased loved ones. These are joyous reunions. Even if people died of disfiguring or illnesses when they were way up in age, they're essentially always picture-perfect health. In my study, I was astonished to find that only 4% of the time beings are encountered in a near-death experience in an unearthly or heavenly realm. Only 4% of the time, these are beings that are alive at the time of the near-death experience. Different from hallucinated met, and that's literally the first time that they encounter them. And I want to emphasize also, deceased beloved pets are often encountered in near-death experiences in these unearthly realms. Once again, joyous reunions. Line of evidence 7, I studied near-death experiences in children age 5 and less. This is sort of an ideal study group because to them, near-death experiences are unknown and unknowable. They have no concepts of death generally. They typically won't have any preconceived notions about what should happen when you die. Looking at that same 33 elements of things that occur during a near-death experience, the near-death experience content was identical. Even though they're culturally practically a blank slate, when very young children have near-death experiences, they're having identical content near-death experiences. A really powerful line of evidence is the fact that near-death experiences have worldwide consistency. You may recall I previously said that portions of our NDE research website are published in over 30 different languages. So we're getting near-death experiences shared literally from all over the world. That has allowed us to do by far the largest cross-cultural study that's ever been possible before. At the conclusion from this extensive study involving hundreds of near-death experiences shared from non-English languages around the world and from over 50 near-death experiences from non-Western countries, bottom line is the near-death experience content, once again, strikingly similar. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether you're, say, a Christian in the United States or a Muslim in Egypt or a Hindu in India. Wherever on the planet you are, if you have a near-death experience, it's going to be strikingly similar. Now, language gets in the way. How do you describe ineffable, unearthly, the kind of remarkable things that people encounter? But if you look at actually what happens, they're remarkably typical. Now, the sternest test of near-death experiences around the world are those that occur in non-Western countries that typically have very different cultural and religious backgrounds. Through my work and also doing several studies with a near-death experience investigator in Iran, we've published several papers on this. Once again, the content appears strikingly similar. The implications of all of this is enormous. Wherever on earth we are, if you have a near-death experience, it seems to be strikingly similar. Really seem to be spiritual beings overall having a human experience here and now in our earth. Line of evidence number 9 is what's called the after effects. In other words, those are the changes in values and beliefs that occur after the near-death experience. Now, I want to emphasize this may take years to fully integrate. When you have an extreme life-changing event, something that is beyond anything you ever thought possible, obviously it can take a long time, often years, to fully integrate those changes in values and belief. But when they do, extensive prospective and retrospective studies of near-death experiences are very consistently finding an increased belief in the afterlife. I mean, that's not a surprise, is it? From the perspective of someone who had a near-death experience, they don't doubt the afterlife because they firmly believe they experienced the afterlife in their near-death experience and they know what lies ahead. Obviously, they have a reduced fear of death for the same reason. They've been through a life-threatening event. They know from their personal belief what happens after they die, and it is certainly good news. They grow to value loving relationships from what they learned during their NDE. They become typically much less materialistic and certainly a greatly increased belief in God. There's certainly other after effects, but those are the most commonly observed. Now we're going to go on to my more recent research, and this is sort of leading edge, if you will. That was my original 9 lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience. We're coming up now to number 10, 11, and 12. Number 10, in the survey, I asked 1,122 people that actually had a near-death experience, straight up, how do you currently view the reality of your experience? Look at that, 95.5% people believe their experience was definitely real. Only about 4% say have any doubt at all and say it was probably real, and less than 1% are of the belief that their experience was not real. That is an astoundingly high percentage, and I think you really have to conclude from this data that out of respect for people's ability to generally understand reality, if skeptics want to represent that near-death experiences are not real, they really need to present strong evidence that near-death experiences are not real. And as we've discussed, the skeptics aren't even close. Skeptics can't explain any of the lines of evidence I'm presenting today, let alone all of them together. Moving on number 11, another line of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences are what's called shared near-death experiences. These are fascinating experiences where 2 or more people have a simultaneous, in other words, occurring at the same time, life-threatening event. And then they can not only observe each other, they can communicate with each other, but they're actually, if you will, sharing the same near-death experience. Like I said, we've had 15 that have been shared with us. They're typical near-death experiences, but they're shared. And I want to illustrate that with a very dramatic account. William shared this some time ago, and this is an example of what can happen during a near-death experience, and this is a shared near-death experience. This is William shares. I was taking my girlfriend to her parents' home in Welland, that's Canada. I went to sleep while driving, then I was aware that we were out of our bodies and quickly flying up towards space, holding hands. They were engaged. We flew straight up for a minute or so when we started to see a park or countryside landscape. Suddenly, we were intercepted by 4 creatures. 2 flanked each of us and began to gently separate us. They overwhelmed us with a feeling of the highest love and compassion that was well beyond anything we could experience on earth, a divine love. We therefore had no resistance to their effort. I recall feeling sort of like a baby in a mother's arms, but it's hard to accurately describe. 2 of them moved her upward toward a distant landscape, and 2 moved me back downward. I felt so much love, peace, and comfort that I wanted to protest and say, no, please, let me stay here. But hearing inwardly, without ears, or psychically, that I could not stay, Next, I could see my car in flames for maybe about a quarter mile up. I felt a sensation of falling and awakened in the car. The front was on fire. I moved her from leaning on me as she was when I fell asleep, knowing that her body was an empty shell. I had left her above with those beings. A very dramatic, very poignant shared near death experience. They were literally sharing a near death experience. Very powerful evidence that what's being described in near death experiences may well be that initial step for those having permanent, irreversible death. Some of the most important recent research I have is there an afterlife? Answer, obviously, yes. So if there's an afterlife, is there God? Well, that's been some of my recent research. I reviewed all near-death experiences shared sequentially over that 3-year period. These were first-person near-death experiences shared in English only. And they had a research scale that was 7 or higher. And they identified an awareness or encounter with God. I was amazed at the consistency in what they described. They over and over described God as overwhelmingly loving, overwhelmingly accepting them of who they are and for all that they are. They have enormously positive feelings in God's presence. God's appearance can be variable, but typically described as an unearthly, brilliant white light. They're usually very certain they encountered God. They often say, what I encountered, God is an earthly term, an earthly word. What I encountered was beyond any earthly word. Often God will be involved in sending the person back to their earthly life. It's very common for them to have a powerful sense of unity. And they usually use the word unity more than just a connection. Afterlife or heavenly realms, when they're in an unearthly heavenly realm, just briefly, time and space radically seems different from Earth. They typically say time does not exist. Beautiful landscapes have been described when they're in that unearthly realm beyond anything on Earth. There's buildings and cities. It's always dramatic to me that when they're in that unearthly or heavenly realm, they may describe colors that are beautiful beyond anything that could even possibly exist on Earth. They may describe beautiful music that is so beautiful that it's beyond anything that could possibly be conceivable on Earth, beyond anything that they ever knew. Typically, in these unearthly heavenly realms, they have, once again, that powerful feeling of peace and love. In fact, the two most common words, among the two most common words used to describe near-death experiences, love and peace. And interestingly, when they're in that unearthly realm, even though that seems so different from our earthly life, there's very often a powerful awareness that this unearthly, this beautiful heavenly realm is their real home. And that seems to be true not only for the person having the near-death experience, but for all of us. A really profound message of hope delivered from those that have had near-death experiences. So thank you very